Okay, great stuff. Then we'll get going. Because despite the fact that there wasn't a heck of a lot in the budget, Stuart and I've got a lot to get through. There's a lot of stuff in there if you kind of expand it out and look at the wider picture as well as some of the specifics for local government. So splitting up today, I'll start off going through what was in the budget this week, looking at some of the wider stuff, the macroeconomic stuff, the fiscal policy stuff, and how that kind of filters down to what we might get in local government. I think it's important to see that wider context and see how it comes down to us. Then Stuart will do a session on looking at the spring budget from different angles, looking at it from what that means, particularly about what happens to us in terms of spending reviews and allocations, and just that insight into, what where things are within Whitehall and what that means for local government. Then I'll finish up very quickly just looking at some of the very specific stuff, things around what we might put in our MTFP model, what sort of assumptions we might put in there. And then there's a couple of very specific local government finance announcements that we need to look at from the budget too. Just to let you know that we are recording at the moment, and a recording of the webinar will be on our website. I've said tomorrow, it won't be, it'll be Monday, but it'll be there then. But I will put the slides on straight away, so if you want to see the slides and use them, they're there to look at too. Just to confirm where you can get hold of the information, we did send out our briefing note on Wednesday about 6 o'clock after the announcement. You can get all the papers there, all the kind of subsidiary papers as well. It's worth having a good trawl through that to see what's there. And as ever, the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibilities, updated fiscal and economic forecasts are always really good as well. A lot of the actual nuts and bolts that we kind of get hold of to put in our briefing notes, we get from the OBR stuff, which is excellent. And then two links there to the two main things that I've used actually, which is the IFS's webinar yesterday morning and all their slides as well, and the same with the Resolution Foundation. Really good work from those two think tanks that we take a lot of their stuff and use it, and got some of that today in the webinar. I know Stuart spent a lot of time looking at other things as well. There are lots of different groups and think tanks that produce some really good stuff the day after the budget. So the headlines, it was a really low-key budget statement. I don't want to say boring, but it was a bit dull for quite long stretches. I'm not quite sure how he managed to string it out for an hour and 10 minutes. The headlines really were about, in national terms, a further cut of 2p in national insurance contributions, some very minor changes in forecasts, and actually some of the forecasts, given it's only 6 months after the autumn statement, we've been quite used to things moving around a lot between fiscal events, but actually things haven't moved that much between events. And the other key thing for us, there were no changes in future spending assumptions. We had thought that the Chancellor would downgrade future spending growth to pay for his tax cuts. That didn't happen. Really importantly as well, in terms of the mechanics of all this stuff for us for 25-26 for our budgets in local government, departmental expenditure plans won't be announced until the spending review, and the spending review won't take place until after the general election. So all we've got now to go on a very, very general high level assumptions around spending plans, nothing specific, and we won't get that until there's a new government in place. All the indications are that the election will be in the autumn, and possibly there'll be a further fiscal event before then. It's all very speculative, ministers saying various things, but in very kind of elliptical terms. So it's difficult to know, but my guess would be the autumn, and my guess would be they may get one final event in before that election as well. As a continued improved push for productivity increases in the public sector, it seems, given the scale of the challenge, it seems like fairly small beer, but that's kind of in turn, those productivity gains are in return for having no change in our future spending plans. So they've stuck with that 1% real terms growth in future spending. Most commentators agree that those future spending plans are unrealistically tight. So we're kind of having to go on the basis of what a government's saying before the election, but they do seem very tight. And certainly as you kind of drill down, I can't really see if local government did get that kind of settlement, I think it'd be fairly catastrophic, to be honest. There's very little that's new that directly affects local government in the budget, and there's certainly no new funding. We've got that big tranche of funding just before the final settlement, but nothing on top of that. However, there is a continuation of the household support fund for 6 months. I know for many authorities that was actually a really big deal. So it's kind of a partial victory, a continuation, yes, but only for 6 months, which kind of leaves it very vulnerable to just being got rid of or not being renewed fully for 2025, 26. Then there were numerous smaller funding pots, mostly loosely linked to levelling up, but very loose really, and another further round of devolution deals, which in some ways feels like that's the meatiest part of the whole budget when it comes to local government. So lots of interesting stuff there as well. So looking at that macro picture, the basic problem for the economy and for the public finances is that growth's very low. There's been a slow recovery from the energy price shock. As we know, there was a shallow recession in quarters 3 and 4 of 2023. So really low, well, just marginal contraction in the economy. There's this marginally improved GDP growth forecast for 2025, up to 1.9% rather than 1.5%. And then it hits the trend growth rate of about 2% from 25 onwards. I think a lot of other forecasts, though, actually have been less optimistic than the OBR. Certainly the Bank of England's much less optimistic. The OBR's come for quite a lot of criticism over the last, and sort of the run up to the budget, saying that it was it'd been too pessimistic, it had boxed the government in. But actually, evidence shows that actually the OBR has been slightly over optimistic than anything else. So that does leave the question hanging for us and for the public sector generally: is can the UK economy achieve that level of growth? Is it realistic? And if it can't achieve that level of growth, then actually the pressure on the public finances will be even greater. So this is kind of like almost the key thing, I think, that kind of hangs over us for what's going to happen for our funding over the next Parliament. If there's not enough growth, then things will be less good than we've even got in our numbers now. I guess a piece of good news is that consumer price index is falling actually quite rapidly now. The Resolution Foundation say that the OBR has called time on high inflation, and obviously that will lead to reduced interest rates, as evidenced there in that comment. So that's good on that side. And for departments and offices of local government who are providing services, a reduction in inflation reduces the real terms pressure on budgets for public services. So unit costs don't increase as quickly as they were. So that helps us a lot, given that our funding allocations are cash based. Lower inflation means that they go further. But it does slow the nominal growth in taxation revenue. So for the Treasury, that actually does squeeze the amount of headroom that it's got, because tax revenues are not growing as quickly as they would have been with higher levels of inflation. And for local government, of course, all our business rate baselines and settlement funding assessment are in theory linked to the September CPI. So whatever that CPI is going to be later this year, that in theory is how our baselines are indexed, and also how much by the settlement funding assessment is indexed as well. So that looks like it's going to be around 2%. As I mentioned, with the slightly lower trend growth for taxation, although GDP is almost the same size as it was back in November, it's about 0.1% higher, the cash size of the economy is slightly smaller because inflation is weaker. So that, as I said in the previous slide, or previous couple of slides, that does translate into lower nominal taxation receipts. So you can see there on the right hand side, and I've just worked out how to use a laser pointer. So that bit over here is you can see there that the solid black line, that's the spring budget forecast for national taxation. The dotted lines was last November, so you can see the forecast is slightly lower. Annual borrowing requirement is falling, but actually the forecasts are almost entirely unchanged from last November. So you can see down here on the right hand side, those forecasts for the later part of the forecast are pretty much exactly the same as they were 6 months ago. So projected borrowing is falling down to 39 billion by 2028, and that kind of suggests on the face of it that the Treasury is getting control of public finances. But I think, as we probably all know, that in those final years of that forecast, there's a lot of uncertainty about spending plans. There's a lot of back-funded tax increases, like the fuel duty escalator that are not going to happen. So although it looks like it's under control, actually there's an awful lot of things that need resolving before then. And as we all also know, spending pressures are intense and they will need more funding. So there's going to be a lot of pressure towards the back end of that forecast. Debt remains high and is only just falling in 2028-29, so year 5 of the forecast. The fiscal rule requires debt to be falling in that 5th year of a forecast, and it is, but only just. So it's falling from 93.2% of GDP to 92.8% of GDP. So only marginally falling. They've only just marginally managed to get a set of forecasts that achieve that fiscal rule. And the forecasts, as you can see there, they're almost entirely unchanged from 6 months ago. But what that does mean is that any forecasts are very vulnerable to worsening economic performance, to pressures on spending, to changes in forecasts. So if the Chancellor is thinking about another fiscal event before the election, there is always the risk that actually the forecasts worsen and actually he doesn't have any money for tax cuts and actually he needs to tighten his belt rather than have a giveaway before the election, which I'm sure will be the last thing that he wants. Looking at those key budget decisions, tax cuts largely funded by tax increases. You can see there from the Resolution Foundation, really useful chart showing you what the tax cuts have been, about 13-14 billion pounds worth of tax cuts, funded from some slight improvements in the forecasts, as well as some tax rises that is used to actually plug the gap. As we know, the Prime Minister and Chancellor wanted to have a 2p cut in income tax, but that's probably, well, it was too expensive. 1p cost about 7 billion, so it was cheaper to do the national insurance contribution cut. And I think he kind of rationalised that during his statement by almost saying, well, actually, let's try and get rid of national insurance. It's probably too expensive to do. I think it's worth about 40 billion, but that's clearly kind of one of the things he might start to wave around in the election. I won't go through these in any detail. These were the tax changes, a number of cuts, national insurance contributions, the high income child benefit charge, and then this interesting one where he's reduced the higher rate of property capital gains tax from 28 to 24%, and the Treasury and the OBR both think that will actually increase revenue. So that's a good one. And then a number of other smaller, well, actually some quite large tax increases that will fund the other tax cuts. Changing the regime for the taxation of non-domiciled individuals is particularly good, raises about £3 billion annually. Taking a slightly longer view about what's happening with taxation and fiscal policy, it's definitely been a tax increase in Parliament, and as the Resolution Foundation say here, it will take the tax burden to its highest, 37.1%, since 1948, so just after the Second World War. So you can see there just how much the tax burden has grown by in recent years for reasons that we know. And a lot of that tax increase is from fiscal drag rather than from increases in tax rates. So that's been turbocharged by a spike, the recent spike in inflation. That's why the Chancellor's been able to generate quite a lot of increased tax revenues whilst claiming to be cutting tax rates at the same time. But that's what's behind it, and a lot of pressure on increasing taxation to fund all the pressures within the public sector. Is there any prospect of a future government reducing the tax burden? I think Paul Johnson, in his commentary on the budget, said that he didn't think that would happen during his lifetime. So it feels like we're kind of here, and we're here for good now, or here for the long term at least. I think there'll be actually possibly further pressure to fund increases in public services, increased funding from more taxation. So this might not be the high point. This might be, on the road to even higher increases in taxation and a higher percentage of the economy being allocated to funding public services. For the Chancellor, the headroom that he's got is really small. It's only 8.9 billion, down from 13 billion last November. So that's a very, very small margin, given the scale of public spending and public taxation. and also the uncertainty of forecasts that can easily shift from day to day or week to week as different bits of information come in. Before any measures were taken during the budget, the Chancellor started off with £12.2 billion worth of headroom, and effectively the cost of the policy announcements was about 3.2 billion. So he didn't have much to play with at the beginning of the budget setting process, and hasn't got an awful lot left at the end of it. So as the Resolution Foundation says, that leaves fiscal buffers that are wafer thin. Total managed expenditure, as you can see, kind of going back to the middle part of the last decade, the trend rate and the actual increases in managed expenditure have been considerable. A lot of that responding to the pandemic and then responding to the energy crisis, but it's resulted in a larger public sector, in a bigger state, as it were, and more public spending. You can see future spending plans are about £10 billion lower than they were last November, and I think, as far as I can tell, that's because debt interest is down by about £11 billion in today's terms. So slight movement down in the estimates for future debt interest. The only major real spending commitment that came out of the budget was the additional 2.5 billion for the NHS. I hadn't quite realised that for 24-25 that would only just result in small real terms growth for the NHS. So real pressures on that service for various reasons. And I think real pressures are probably higher than we would have seen in the GDP deflator for the NHS. So a lot of pressure there as well. And the IFS is a really useful chart here, again, trying to just indicate what they call an enduringly larger state. So the size of the state is much bigger, or will be much bigger, over the next Parliament than it was just before the pandemic. So just before the pandemic, it was just shy of 40% of national income, and it looks like it's going to settle in at more like 43-44%. It's also interesting that if you look there on the right hand side, you can see there that that dotted yellow line, that's non-debt interest spending, and that has to go below the level of taxation. That's what they call a primary surplus. So in other words, that in order to balance the budget, the tax income that the government's collecting is higher than the amount they're actually spending on day-to-day services. So that's, I think, why we have got that problem with that the real crunch within the public sector and the public services and the public finances. That there's a lot of debt interest that needs to be serviced, and actually lots of the tax revenues now are being used to fund that rather than to fund day-to-day services. Then how does that translate into annual changes in public spending over the next Parliament? This is I think the key thing for local government, because it's really, how does this translate into future funding allocations? So as we know, the headline, that 1% real terms increase in funding for the whole public sector, that's remained in place. That hasn't been downgraded. But as we know, there's a lot of protected services, NHS, defence, schools, and the indications are from the IFS that will be at least a 2% real terms growth required for those services, but they think that could go up to as much as 2.9% real terms growth. So 2% is kind of the best case scenario. It could be as high as 2.9%. But so what that means is that for unprotected services, for everything else, there's going to be at least a 1.9% real terms cut in funding, and that could be as high as a 3.5% real terms cut. So quite a big range there, and quite a big difference in terms of what that means for unprotected services. So if you think that inflation is going to be around 2%, then that means that best case scenario, funding for unprotected services is flat in cash terms. But if the real terms cut is actually 3.5%, then we could be looking at an average cash terms cut in spending for non-protected services of minus 1.5%. So a cash terms freeze in funding for unprotected services, including local government, is pretty harsh compared to what we've had recently. But a 1.5% cash terms cut would really be, I think, probably unachievable, to be honest. So just to get a few other metrics in there, as the IFS said, unprotected services in England facing cuts of up to 3.5% per year over the next Parliament. That compares to around cuts of around 6% in real terms per year between 2010 and 2015. So not as severe, and does show you just how much funding was cut between 2010 and 2015. So not that severe, but still severe compared to the recent past and compared to what we need. The IFS estimate that there would need to be a top up of about 10 billion to 20 billion to avoid cuts on this sort of scale. So it's not beyond the bounds of possibility, but that's still a lot of money to find when the public finances are quite so tight. And it's also why the Chancellor has indicated that he wants to make productivity gains. He's mentioned trying to find productivity gains of 20 billion. What he says is that the OBR has estimated that if public sector productivity returned to its pre-pandemic level, that would generate £20 billion worth of cashable savings. So that's kind of what he's got his eye on. Would a new government find more funding? Are these cuts plausible given expectations around public service? I don't think they are plausible, and most commentators are saying the same thing. So I think we need to take them with a pinch of salt. I think in terms of our budget planning and forecasting, I think these are the numbers that we have to base our forecasts on. But just to be aware that things, and probably not going to be quite as severe as this, but that's I think the starting point for any forecasting that we do. What the IFS have also gone on to say is that what they've found is that every spending review after a general election, there's been a top up, with the exception of 2010. So in other words, that lots of governments go into a general election actually with quite tight finances, and then after the election start to increase taxes to get more money to spend. But the problem, I think, is as well that the forecasts as they are for public spending, there are still no specifics. So we don't know where the cuts would fall. We don't know whether local government will be favoured or more heavily cut. And we also take a fair view from the IFS that in future there will be a top up that will be very likely. In short, what the IFS says is that this leaves an almighty headache for the next government at the post-election spending review. So lots of difficult decisions to be taken. Productivity was quite an interesting strand, I thought, in the statement that the Chancellor made, and took up quite a lot of the time actually of the statement. As I've mentioned already, the OBR has estimated that if the public sector could reattain its pre-pandemic productivity levels, that would save the equivalent of 20 billion. So what the Chancellor's trying to do is to try and square the circle by saying that if those could be achieved, if we just went back to a pre-pandemic world, it would be possible to live with more constrained spending without cutting services. He also said it's not right to ask taxpayers to pay for more when productivity has fallen. And I can see that, something really reasonable in that. It's just a question about whether the public sector can get back to where it was 5 years ago. I wasn't quite sure entirely what plans were being launched and when. He talked about a landmark public sector productivity plan. The Treasury, as far as I could see, had launched a plan about 4 days previously. I'm guessing that they were one and the same thing. But that Treasury plan was looking at making savings over 5 years and indicating savings of about 1.8 billion, which is a good deal less than the 20 billion that the Chancellor's looking for. So it seemed a little bit lacking in scale given what he wanted to achieve. But I guess everything has to start somewhere. A lot of the focus was on the NHS. Quite a lot of it also was on police. But there were a couple of mentions of investing to get greater productivity in local government. So there was talk of £165 million to build new children's social care places. That's about 200 places. So there's more in-house provision rather than using expensive external providers, and about £105 million for 15 new special free schools. So quite big ambitions at the top of the agenda, and then relatively small amounts of money being spent to try and achieve that. So it seemed to be a little bit lacking in ambition when you really sort of drilled down. Question is, how does that fit in with spending plans? There's already a notional target of 0.5% productivity gains built into the spending projections for the next Parliament. So it's difficult to work out how that does all work together. and in reality, we're not going to find that out until the spending review after the election. I think a lot of it's hampered as well by the fact that the budget, the Chancellor's cut back a lot on public sector net investment, on capital investment. You raid capital investment and it makes it difficult to improve productivity. So the two things don't really quite gel. But because the fiscal rules include borrowing for investment alongside borrowing for revenue spending, all borrowing is bad and all counts against the headroom. So that's why the Chancellor has had to cut back on capital investment. So you can see there that it's shelving off really quite substantially now, back down to the 45-year average. So it has been relatively high in the recent past, but it looks like it'll be quite a lot lower in the near future. So that's me finished for the first session. I'll hand over to Stuart. Oh, Stuart. There we are.
Yeah. There we are. Hello, everyone. So this is the version which has no numbers in it, which might be a great relief to many of you. When I was a kid, I viewed budgets with horror and dismay. It was the one day in the year in which the entire children's TV schedule was swept to one side in favour of dull talking heads. So Robin Day replaced Blue Peter. So what's changed in the interim? Well, we've got more TV channels now. Let's see if today we can do better than Robin Day. But so I'm going to start with a note on kind of process and background, just to put the whole thing in a bit of context. In government, budgets are predominantly a treasury exercise, bringing in HMRC on sort of practical delivery, but there's very much a sort of guarded approach to the whole thing, and other departments are only brought in as necessary on specific narrow issues. So the level of secrecy is very high, partly because some of it's market sensitive, but also for political reasons. And that means that throughout government, if you have an issue that's in the budget, you've got quite a pixelated perspective on that. You see small bits of various documents, like a line from the speech, a paragraph from the budget document, maybe some stuff on impact appraisal that relates to your issue. Even prime ministers are involved to different degrees. So, for example, we know that Cameron and Osborne worked quite closely together on budgets, but if you read Alistair Campbell's diaries, the picture with Blair and Brown was somewhat different. And the cabinet as a whole is only briefed on the budget as a whole in the morning. So it's that last minute, and it's that much Treasury led. One of the first budgets I was involved in was the introduction of the landfill tax in 1996. That was the issue I led on. And it's interesting, I looked back yesterday, the standard rate on implementation was £7 per tonne. £7 per tonne. The rate as of Wednesday is now £103.70 per tonne. That's quite extraordinary, isn't it? That was also the year, incidentally, in which the entire budget speech was leaked to the press. So the budget then the thrust is very much tax policy. It's not on extra spending generally, and it's usually held in March. And one of the more recent features since 2010 has been the advent of the Office for Budget Responsibility. So their job is to provide independent economic forecasts and independent analysis of public finances, and in particular to scrutinise and analyse the Treasury's costing of tax and spending measures. And they do that on a 5-year horizon, which is of course often beyond the time scale of the spending review plans. So that they're giving a kind of look forward that often outstrips government. The OBR gets the plans for the budgets 2 weeks in advance. I'm really sorry if that punctures the myth of the Chancellor staying up late with a single desk lamp illuminating his process of finalising the budget the evening before it's actually finalised, basically 2 weeks in advance. But what that does is it introduces a degree of discipline, transparency, and external credibility that would not otherwise be there. And it actually influences how governments approach economic policy, not just the process of the budget, but generally in the knowledge that there will be this information available to the media and commentators and the general public if they're sufficiently interested. And we've only got to see the effect of disregarding those kind of processes of discipline and credibility in the impact of the Truss Kwarteng debacle and the way that they sidelined the OBR and what happened thereafter. So that's budgets. The other big fiscal event is spending reviews, and these take varying lengths of time depending on the ambition. They can be done very quickly, as short as a month or two, if the aim is just to roll forward the existing plans with some minor modifications, but they take much longer if you're planning fundamental policy changes. They're usually conclude in the early autumn or even the preceding summer, and they last various different times. So the 2010 spending review lasted 4 years, 2015, 5 years, 2020 was only 1 year, 2021 was 3 years again. And it's that combination of horizons together with the time available to make adjustments that leads to the terrible record of 6 one-year local government finance settlements. It's primarily driven because there isn't the horizon of forward amounts of money to act in the longer term. So as Adrian said, the Chancellor confirmed, which was not at all a surprise, that the next spending review will be after the general election. The government's never going to want to spend the time and energy and the political capital to go through a difficult process towards the end of a parliament. And he also said that there'd be a much stronger emphasis on invest to save and productivity in this spending review if he was returned to office. The thing that characterises the spending review as opposed to the budget is that there are bids by department. They're not really called bids, but they are in effect bids, often constrained with an overall spending envelope. And as I said, these are often associated with major policy changes, changes in approach for the policy areas concerned. So that's basically the process that will be followed to allocate the forward public expenditure sums that were reaffirmed on Wednesday. And it is a sort of a more collegiate, albeit a bilateral process between the Treasury and individual departments. And then the final beast in the kind of inventory of fiscal statements are autumn statements. And they've been in place, I think, since about 2018. They're often combined with a spending review. So they cover in any event tax and spending, and they take place in the late autumn, and it's the confirmation in the late autumn that drives the settlement timing into December, which is the reason why we all get the numbers much later than would be ideal. And the overall idea of 2 fiscal events per year leads to a sense of continual tinkering, the temptation to make changes on each occasion, and also to make headline grabbing changes is always there, and sort of acts against medium to long term planning, as the Institute for Government have argued. Okay, let's move on then to a selection of the main budget measures. I've picked some of my favourites here. So first of all, the kind of overall assessment and the timings moving forward. It was a very curious quiet, low-key budget in many ways, wasn't it? It didn't feel like the last budget before a general election. And in part that was because of a heavily constrained position that the Chancellor found himself in. But it also raised the question in many people's minds about whether we might see another fiscal event before the next election if circumstances improve sufficiently. So there's no commitments to that, but there's quite a lot of speculation about that. I said it was a heavily constrained position. Essentially what the Chancellor was doing is he's trying to cut taxes from an all-time high. He's trying to have a strongest narrative as he can on improving public services, and he must meet his fiscal rules. In fact, there's only one fiscal rule, which I'll come back to in a minute. And you'll form a view about how he managed to do that and how credible that was, and whether there's any gaming or political positioning in his what he said on Wednesday. Certainly, in my mind, it shortened the odds on an autumn general election. It seems much more likely now that we're going in the autumn. In turn, that means I think it's less likely that we'll see an immediate multi-year spending review. And certainly less likely still that we'll see a multi-year settlement. One perfectly plausible outcome is we'll see a one-year spending review with some added extras to get us through the first year, and then a more thoughtful, longer process culminating in a multi-year spending review for the rest of the Parliament. And the same thing mirrored on the settlement side, a one-year settlement and then a multi-year settlement with some elements of reform. For me, that's the kind of central bit, and it's actually independent of which party wins the election. It's driven primarily by the timing of the general election and the events that need to follow thereafter. So, on Wednesday, the Chancellor met his fiscal rule that debt should be falling as a percentage of GDP by 28-29. It's a slightly odd fiscal rule, and it's certainly not the strongest or most comprehensive since these were invented by Gordon Brown, I think. But anyway, he met it, but he met it with historically low margins for error and a very contingent picture. The headroom that remains is much smaller than the margin of error on any of the forward predictions on GDP or inflation or anything like that. So the headroom could easily disappear. It could increase. It could go negative. His priority remained tax cuts. So the same as in November, he did his best to deliver the tax cuts he could, primarily freezing fuel duty and 2% off national insurance, which was then rapidly translated into a longer-term ambition to get rid of this tax, which is a perfectly sensible thing to want to do. National insurance is a bad tax. It's a tax on labour and employment compared to income tax, which is at least a broader tax than national insurance. It is the one to focus on in my view. And he funded those tax increases. Calculations vary between different sources, but maybe around half from tax increases on non-DOMs, the energy levy, vaping, and about half with it by borrowing within the available headroom. So the OBR's overall conclusion is that the outlook for public finances was similar to it was in November, which is actually an argument against too many fiscal events. So within that small headroom, he managed to squeeze out the tax decreases that we saw. But the plans remain in place for a 1% real terms growth in public expenditure per annum over the forward period. And that actually translates into no real terms growth per capita over the 5-year period. So once you take into account population growth, you've got no real terms growth in public expenditure over 5 years. And the IFS takes that a step further by differentiating between protected services, so the NHS, education. Did anyone notice the commitment to increase defence spending to 2.5% of national income? So those protected services on the one hand and unprotected services on the other, hands up local government. And when you do that, you find there's a real term spending per capita on unprotected services will fall somewhere between 2.4 and 4% per annum over the 5-year period. What chances of fundamental local government finance reform against that background? And that's it, really. There are no further details of how those figures at national level will be divided between services or departments. Departments are in the dark compared to the forward position on taxes, which is quite detailed. Departments and of course councils have no information about what happens next. But to put it in context, the Resolution Foundation reckons that is about 3/4 of the size of the package of austerity cuts in the 2010 Parliament, so 2010 to 2015, about 3/4 of that size. So his overall strategy, then, we can see, is to set tight spending limits to maximise the scope for tax cuts. And as part of that, to play a kind of political game, to steal Labour's tax cuts, so the energy level and non-DOMs, for example, that serves to reduce their lines of attack, but also takes away that money that they were hoping to use for another purpose. So stealing their tax cuts, that in turn raises the question, does the Chancellor really believe that this is the right package for the country were he to be returned to power afterwards? Does he believe that these reductions in public expenditure are deliverable in the current context? Or is this just a short-term electoral strategy and he knows that there will be purposeful or top-ups under pressure in the period after the election? Or is it merely a trap for Labour to take away their scope for manoeuvre on tax decreases or tax increases rather, and to force them into spending plans which either are not credible within the level of receipts that the government can secure, or if their return to power are not deliverable. And then the Conservatives are playing a slightly longer game to say, Labour may be in for one term, but it's going to be such a mess, we'll be in for the term after that. So you can form your own theory as part of that. But in any case, at this point, enter stage left public sector productivity programme, or for local authorities, productivity plans, which had previously been announced in the context of the annual settlement. So the OBR reckons that if productivity in the public sector was raised by 5%, that could generate £50 billion, and that's the kind of fall in productivity from the pre-pandemic period. And some extra investment was announced to help secure that. So 900 million per annum from 25-26, directed at the NHS, at children's services, as we've heard, but not at councils more generally. There's no promise of extra investment for productivity plans there. Departments will have to produce their own plans for the whole of the public sector, and as I said, councils have already had plans commissioned. Interesting, just as a footnote on all this, a lot of the pre-briefing for the budget was on the use of consultants and discredited EDI schemes. That didn't, as far as I can see, feature in either the speech or the formal budget documentation. My view that this emphasis on productivity in the public sector is welcome and long overdue. Councils have been producing efficiency and productivity improvements since at least 2010. Actually, before that, I remember when I worked in local government, this was a focus on activity. And significant gains have been made since 2010, but moving forward, it needs a proper strategy with a clear sense of the role of central government, the role of local government, the role of representative bodies of local government, the role of third parties. It needs, in some cases, financial support and invest to save. It needs a proper plan, and that's what I hope comes out of this long overdue interest in productivity. Oflog could play a significant role here. Right, next, devolution deals, the usual blizzard of changes on all this. North East Trailblazer deal, Buckinghamshire, Warwickshire, Surrey Level 2 deal, West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, Liverpool City region, West Midlands Level 4 deals announced last week. More on the Manchester, West Midlands single settlements. All that is welcome, and particularly the extra resources for the areas concerned. But it's all on a central template, isn't it? And it's all limited and controlled in scope by central government. And it's very much based on a notion of earned autonomy. Central government saying, you can have these freedoms and extra responsibilities and scope to improve your local area, provided you do these things. So it's that sense of earned autonomy, and it's ultimately limited by government capacity and government resources, isn't it? So it's very far from what some of us might want to see, a more universal, locally initiated and unconstrained devolution, or at least using that as a starting point for negotiations. Finally, a shout out for the plans for towns, 400 million for 20 towns, and some smaller place-based pots around culture, creative industries, heritage, and don't forget village halls. Right. Finally, and very briefly, the missing budget measures. Yes, extra public expenditure, except for productivity. Well, look, this wasn't unexpected, was it? We saw a significant injection of funds in the settlements, and because of the nature of the budget, the focus on taxation, because of the timing of the budget, and because of the overall political strategy, we didn't really expect any additional resources, did we? Despite some of the commentary. We could have seen something on the approach to allocating public resources and resources to local authorities. We could have had some commitments to a longer term planning process, to less competition, to less ring fencing, fewer rules and restrictions. We didn't see that. We could have seen some tax reform stuff on council tax. Most people agree it's regressive and out of date. We could have seen something on revaluation, on commitments to extra tax bans. We didn't see that. Business rates reform, still a substantial industry lobby on this. There's a general anti-avoidance rule consultation, not a new idea, but very good to see that finally surface. Nothing on business rates retention reform, but lots of extra complexity for the system that you have to operate through reliefs, devo deals, investment zones, free ports. And then there's fiscal devolution. We could have seen something on new taxes, on varying existing taxes, on assigned central revenues. We didn't see anything on that. There was silence. That's me done. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks, Stuart. It's brilliant. It's really interesting to get like a different view on, an insider's view really on how a lot of this stuff works. And from our local government perspective, we're trying to work out how it comes through to us, but understanding more about the mechanics is absolutely fascinating. Thank you. A few final things just to before 11 o'clock, just to talk about some of the specific stuff about what that means for local government. Interesting enough, I looked at this article from David Phillips from the IFS, and that was actually published just before the budget. Actually, quite prescient, really. A couple of things that are worth picking out here. Even more common are net tax rises in the 12 months following a general election, and we've kind of seen the slide that goes with that. But it's just worth recognising that is quite a common pattern. So bearing that in mind for what might happen after the election. and in the spending review, either the 1 year one or the multi-year one, whatever that might be, that we get after the election. And as he's quite right to say that councils will have to wait until after the election to get any clarity about their future funding in the next Parliament. One point I think that he makes here that I think is actually really quite useful for context, which is that English councils' core funding is set to be 11% higher in real terms in 24-25 than it was in 21-22, after just adjusting for basic inflation. And I think that's quite important to recognise that the last 5 years, I know Jeff is going to pick me up on this afterwards, is that the last 5 years we've had good settlements in cash terms, we've had good settlements in real terms compared to economy-wide inflation. It just hasn't been enough in recent years to cover increases in costs. So if our future funding trajectory is going to be lower than it's been in the last 4 or 5 years, and if we can't get spending under control to what it has been in the previous past, the sector's going to be in a lot of trouble financially. Yeah, that's the point that David makes after this. Whether growth in these costs slows down will be vital for future councils, for councils' future financial health. So it's really, really, really important that the increases in the expenditure can be constrained, particularly as funding is likely to be much more constrained over the next Parliament than it's been over the last 4 or 5 years. So what does that mean for settlements in the next spending review period? I mean, in our modelling, we've taken the kind of default assumption that grants within core spending power, including settlement funding assessment, will be flat in cash terms. Currently, SFA, in theory, well, in practice, is linked to CPI inflation. That's what the 2 elements within it, based on funding level and RSG, have gone up in line with inflation, with anything underfunded gone through the cap compensation grant. So that's where a lot of the increases in funding have come over the last 4 or 5 years. My guess is that, well, I can't really quite see how you do link core spending power and grants within core spending power to inflation. But as we've seen, there could be cash terms cuts, maybe cash terms cuts of 1.5%, and there's a potential range there of different amounts of change. I think the problem is that if you, as we've seen in the recent past, if you don't link those grants and don't link SFA with inflation, it causes a lot of consequences within the settlement. It kind of raised the problem of things like negative RSG and lots of kind of like just practical problems within the settlement. So it would need quite a lot of re-engineering to cope with having a flat or cash terms cut in the grants within core spending power. It's possible that Treasury in the future might take into account council's ability to increase council tax when they set spending totals over the next Parliament. That could be used as a justification for giving local government bigger cash terms cuts in grant funding than other parts of the public sector. That's kind of what happened between 2010 and 2015. Personally, I think that would leave local government with cuts in funding that were just way too big for the sector to handle. So my view is that's probably too extreme and fairly unlikely, but it's worth bearing in mind as a worst case scenario. No indication really at this point about what might happen with Band D in the future. Our view is that it will continue, or the thresholds for increases will continue at the same rate as they've been in the last couple of years, 4.99% for social care, 2.99% for core increases for other types of authority. In our view, I think that seems likely. I think it's actually quite essential that we're able to increase council tax by that sort of threshold, if not higher in some cases. Labour, I think, has talked about council tax freezes. I'm not sure how realistic that is, or that's a genuine proposal, or just flying a kite as a potential. But council tax is going to be really important over the next 4 or 5 years. Our view is that it'll be unlikely that there'll be no further increase in social care grants. No mention of that in the budget. We didn't really expect it, as Stuart said, but obviously there was a big increase, that £500 million increase in social care grants just before the final settlement, the biggest increase between provisional and final that we can remember. So, you can see how important that increase in social care funding actually is. And our view is that existing social care grants will be baselined. So that kind of results in increases in core spending power that are kind of in the 4% to 4.5% kind of range, as long as Band D council tax is going up by the same sort of amount, but probably or possibly lower than that, and clearly and certainly much lower than they've been in the recent past, where we've had core spending power increases of 10% and more in the current year, 7.5% next year. I can't see anything other than a rollover settlement in 25-26, as Stuart said. Just the sheer mechanics of it make it so difficult in practical terms. A couple of final things. I thought that in the devolution stuff, the single settlements were really interesting. Obviously important for Greater Manchester and West Midlands, but also as kind of like an indicator of what might be on offer for the rest of the sector. If we behave well and the future government wants to do this kind of thing. A couple of things to pull out. One is that current formulas will be used to distribute funding within that single settlement, so no change in funding formula, and the MCAs won't be any worse off than they would have been had they stayed outside the single settlement, effectively a no detriment clause. Some mechanics for working out how to set the formula, how to change them, making revisions, etc. A programme board between the MCAs and the Treasury, but with DLUHC continuing to be responsible for the overall framework. And the MCA is given the ability to change up to 10% of their annual quantum between the 5 themes that they've signed up to. So some ability to move money around, but not absolute discretion. So it's interesting as a kind of like a template for what might happen. Household Support Fund, I know quite a lot of authorities really were pleased about this and lobbied very hard for it. So it's about £500 million for the whole UK for the half year to the end of September. I think the problem here is that it's not baselined. It's very uncertain, and the point at which it needs to be renewed will be during probably the general election period. So the chances of more money being found, I'd imagine, are much diminished. So I think that's very risky about whether that does continue into 25-26, or indeed that you get a further 6-month tranche for the rest of this coming financial year. So a big risk around that. And then finally about landfill tax, I didn't realise Stuart was there at the creation of the landfill tax. An increase of about 22% in the rates per tonne, which the intention is that it keeps up better with increases in inflation. The Treasury estimated that would generate about £50 million worth of additional revenue from 25-26 onwards. I've had a few emails from councils with some very different sorts of costs. One county suggesting they thought it might cost them £7 million, another one saying about 900,000. So quite big differences in estimates. So I'm not entirely sure how those amounts would flow through the sector, but clearly it's one thing to keep in mind. So there we are. I think that's me done on my side as well. So thank you very much for coming along and listening to our views about what's happening, what we think might happen in the near future. If you can't stay with us any longer, you've got to go back to the day job. Thanks for taking the time to join with us, and I'll open the floor up to comments and discussions and any points that you want to make. Ask Stuart any questions you'd like to find out about. Yeah. I think Stuart, for me, it's just I can't quite get my head round what the mechanics actually would be. Say if the election was, beginning of November, they're going to be appointing ministers into the middle of November, and then how do you get a provisional settlement out in December?
So checking I'm still switched on. The closest model to that was actually the last general election, when the Cabinet Office coordinated a list of immediate decisions for ministers, and with the help of the Cabinet Secretary, we were able to get the local government finance settlement right at the top of that list. So what that meant was that not only ministers in our own department, but ministers across government had to be focused on getting that decision through. And it went through in record time, and it meant we were able from the point of a December election to deliver a provisional settlement, which was roughly on the timescales that we had done in previous years. So that's the best model. But this time, as you're sort of hinting, it could be even worse. We could be in the middle of some kind of forward expenditure planning process, some kind of spending review, which might be actually scheduled to last into January, or even beyond, but yet need to know the figure for a settlement. And in that case, I think you just have to take it off to one side and decide, what the amount for the settlement and associated figures was in advance of the general process. But that's more difficult than it sounds for a number of reasons. How can I put this politely? The way the spending review works is to focus on the highest priority specific issues and commitments, and those things are settled first, and other things tend to be lower down the queue. So if you are taking something which is often lower down the queue and putting it higher up, it means that planning the overall process is more difficult. You really want to settle the big ticket items and then look at the overall picture for expenditure and against how much money you've got. So taking something out and settling it early is far from ideal, but might in the worst case be necessary in order to deliver a December provisional settlement, which is really the last day, the last time you can do it. We did look at in December, and actually in previous years when we were having some problems, what would happen if we pushed it into January? And it's not pretty at all. It's not pretty for central government. It's not pretty for Parliament, and it's certainly not pretty for councils. So that is pretty much a double red line. It's got to be in December.
Yeah. So I suppose you just end up, it's almost like a very rapid bilateral negotiation between the department and the Treasury of, okay, what can you give us? We need to get it out within a couple of weeks. Let's get on with
exactly. But it does feel, I mean, it's acute for the settlement, but it's also pressing for so many other areas of expenditure across government. Announcing things in January that are going to take effect in April is far from ideal. So it does push you, if at all possible, to a form of one-year rollover spending review, with some extra amounts of money based on the commitments made in the election. So it's not a complete rollover. And that could well include local government in some scenarios. And then that buys you the time to do a proper considered spending review over a period of months, which picks up issues like productivity and efficiency, but also, broader policy changes like demand management, early intervention, a whole load of things that we haven't seen much time and attention to recent years. Either governing party returning would have more time to do these things, always assuming the majority was reasonably comfortable.
And I guess if you're a new government, especially if it's like a Labour government, not been in power for a while, you would want a little bit of time to actually develop that spending review rather than just chucking out something quickly. I can imagine, having something in place quickly for 25, 26, and then let's take the summer over really thinking about it. For, like you said, with the autumn statement, really has often been a launch pad for a spending review anyway, hasn't it? That kind of timetable.
There's a kind of a thing that always occurred to me was that there's something of a mismatch at the point of the election. The departments, had a bit of an easy time for maybe 6 weeks. It's had nothing to do but think about what's going to happen on day one, day two, first week, first month, and it's rested and refreshed and ready to go and very enthusiastic. And ministers arrive completely exhausted, slightly exhilarated at having won, but and things always take longer than you would hope or assume that they do, because they're naturally they're learning and they're cautious. They don't want to take a decision in week one. It seems really obvious at the time, and discover in week 4 that it was a complete disaster. So, there's a caution and a sort of measured approach, which means that things always move slower than you think or hope they will.
Yeah, and I guess if we that'll be a very early indication about future plans or kind of like assumptions that a new government might have. In the December, we'd need to know obviously what's happening with SFA or the bits of the settlement, and if they're frozen in cash terms, it's like, oh, okay, that's where we're going. The cut in cash terms, well, that looks quite harsh, but it's not. It doesn't tell us exactly what would happen over the whole Parliament and what would be in the spending review proper, but it starts to give an indication of, okay, what sort of assumptions might this government make about future spending?
Yeah, no, that's very true. I suppose if you to think, for example, if a Labour government was returned, you can certainly see that the Treasury outfit will be very powerful again. You can see that in opposition, and
Rachel Reeves
Reeves will work very closely with the Keir Starmer, so there is that power. But equally, it's an open question. I'll put it in quite blunt terms: how badly behaved the Labour Party will be in a post-election scenario. Will we return to positions of kind of discipline and whipping and just generally everyone moving in the right direction, as I'm sure the centre of the party will try to engineer, or has that gone forever, and will we see the same kind of lobbying and behaviour that we've seen under the Conservative government? Is that now the new normal? Is that how governments will proceed? The lobbying that a Labour government would face from outside and from inside will be tremendous, and it will take enormous kind of willpower and strength to resist that. It's really not going to be a very easy position for anyone if they return.
And also looking into the polls that came out this morning, I think there could be about 450 new MPs in Parliament as well.
Yeah.
So that makes a big difference. Yeah.
Well, one thing that Alistair Campbell said on election 97 was, we better go out and meet these new MPs because they had no idea who they were. Lots of them had been elected and they were not expecting to be elected, and so they were a bit horrified actually who had got elected.
Let's open the thing. I was going to go through some of the comments and questions on the chat. Nick, you asked, I don't know if you're still on the call, Nick, asked a couple of questions. One was about LBR forecasts assume annual increases above inflation. I'm guessing that's just because that they assume that they forecast based on current policy and plans, I think. So they're probably assuming that current thresholds are what they are, and they'll continue for another 4 or 5 years. My guess, plus some of their own forecasts around tax-based growth. That kind of makes sense. Do you think 25-26 rollover funding will include the late increases to grant announced for 24-25? I really do. I don't know what you think, Stuart, but I think anything that councils are getting now within core spending power or within the final settlement, that's baseline, isn't it? That's yours, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the OBR assume the past is a guide to the future. So there's a kind of there's a sort of a referendum cap and a precept rolled into it that resemble what we have at the moment.
Yeah. Go on, Nick. What were you going to say, Nick?
No, I was going to say thanks for that. That's encouraging. I sort of assumed it, but we haven't actually built it into our MTFS at this point. So that's a bit of good news. That's
a bonus. Yeah. There's always that risk, isn't there? That, a new spending review period, it's kind of tabula rasa. It's kind of everything's off the table, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's kind of, but practically, I just can't see any. I can't see any social care funding being taken away from local government. To be honest, I just really can't see it. To be honest,
I'm presuming the election will be before the end of September because that's when the household support funding runs out.
I'm assuming it's going to be after the. I'm assuming they're going to announce it after the conference because they need the money for the from conference to run the election. Yeah, but that's a good point though about Nick about the household support fund. Just that getting tied up in sort of like the weeds of other things going on. I think it must be a really strong chance we don't get that second 6 month tranche.
New framework.
Yeah. What else is there? Just scrolling down. Yeah, Tony from Islington. Pretty grim outlook for pretty grim outlook for funding for 25-26. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Do you think it's reasonable to assume additional social care funding other than Precept? I kind of like following on from Nick's question there. I definitely do. There's been an increase in grant funding pretty much every year since 15-16, and I think what's happened between the provisional and final settlements just shows A, how much pressure, and B, how much priority it's got.
Yes, I was going to say that the distinguishing feature of the settlement, which will be very early in the time of a new government, is that it has to be voted on in Parliament. And they won't want that to go wrong. So the precedent is set this year for a substantial injection of funds, which could come at provisional settlement and final settlement.
Yeah, it's almost like the pattern has been set over the last couple of years, last 3, 4, 5 years and more actually, on social care, that you need to put in more than inflation. It needs to have real terms growth in social care. What about
which
section
interestingly changes the emphasis away from the core settlement, which some people on the call may remember used to fund pretty much everything, towards specific grants allocated separately without kind of equalisation in play for the most part, and without flexibility for local authorities to arrange their own affairs.
That's it's one of those things, isn't it, Stuart? When funding is increased, it comes through specific grants. When it's being cut, it goes the cuts come from general grant. Jeff, what were you going to say?
Yeah, morning all. Swan song, Adrian. Here we go.
Your last day. Nearly last day.
Yeah, just a few things. One, that it keeps getting missed, but high need DSG. I mean, bloomin' heck. The amount of money required for the high need DSG is phenomenal, and it'll be interesting when education possibly gets protection in the future, how high need DSG is resolved, and there can't be many authorities who don't have a massive deficit on their high need DSG, so that'll be an interesting one. In terms of timing on the settlement, one of the key things for local government in that settlement period this year will be national living wage. So we've had the madness of the 8, 9, 10% increases to hit the 66% position on national median wage. I know government have asked Low Pay Commission and Mr. Sanderson to have a look again. A terrifying thing is if they shift the 66% to get to 70 or 75, because the pressure that puts into care, homeschool transport, and the impact on our own pay at the bottom levels is phenomenal. So it would be nice to have a national living wage increase of 2% for 25-6. So that is one way government can massively influence budget pressures in local government. And I did notice in the OBR documentation, the position on council tax in future years, the increases were averaging between 4 and 5%. So once you rip out tax base, then I'm assuming it's back to the old 3% position at that stage in the OBR figures.
Rob, who'll be your replacement, Jeff has said there could be an arms race between the political parties on promises to raise national living wage in the election. You can quite easily see that kind of like parties almost shooting from the hip, really, to say, we put it by even more than that. You can see that, can't you? And then those chickens coming home to roost in the settlement or in the following couple of years.
And of course we've now got the trade union pay request for next year, 10%.
Yeah, it's fairly chunky, that, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know what you guys think about the impact that potential Section 114s might have on this government in the run up to the election, and then a new government after the election. You know, it's that risk, I guess, that from a Treasury point of view, you know, how much can we bear down on the local government finance settlement and, you know, give away as little as possible, and on the other side, we can't put in so little that councils become vulnerable and start failing financially. I'd have thought politically that must be a big deal.
I guess it depends, Adrian, if a large Conservative-run county council does Section 114.
Yeah, in the run up to the general election, and I don't know. There's quite a lot of councils put in those have got extraordinary financial support, and quite different sorts of councils as well. So it's not beyond the bounds of possibility. And even
I think,
going through it.
I think originally the calculation implicit and not stated anywhere was that it was actually cheaper to bill out the more problematic authorities who, you know, were authorities with difficult financial histories than it was to, if you like, bail out the whole country and fund people at a level where it was reasonably certain there would be no 114s. It was, if you like, it was a targeted strategy. You know, we're not going to give out that much money, and maybe a few will go into that territory, but you know, they will be ones, as Jeff is hinting at, that, you know, deserved it in inverted commas. They had taken bad decisions. Their history was well known. But we're moving beyond that now, aren't we? This is my kind of boats with the tide going out theory. And different authorities are starting to hit the rocks, and it's becoming a more nuanced calculation, a more difficult calculation to make. And that's, you know, not least because there's quite a lot of media interest and momentum behind this now in a way that there hasn't been for local government finance for quite a long time, and the government feels quite a lot of heat for that, I think. But much will depend on whether and what high profile failures there are between now and the election.
Yeah, I think there's a panorama program on Monday coming up as well, which kind of just adds to that idea that, you know, mainstream political commentary programs are talking about local government funding. There's quite big figures talking about it as well. It's quite a big, as you say, it's becoming a big headline deal, isn't it? And what's it said? That's the Pottery Barn motto. You broke it, you own it. Yeah, it's gonna. you've got to be. Yeah, it's important stuff. Couple other things.
Wishing they had the conversion to productivity somewhat earlier than they have.
Yeah. Could have got something out of that. Yeah. Let's just catch up on a few. Richard, any news on the flexible use of receipts consultation? I haven't seen anything. Keep aware. I don't know if anyone else is. I don't think it's out, is it? I'll keep an eye on that. Phil, any more info on how the 45 million match funding for children's social care places will be allocated? I don't know about that. I've not really even looked, actually, so that's one thing I'll put on my agenda to look at. Peter, Cornwall, what are people's views on further Newham's bonus in 25-26? I think we're going to go for there'll be one further year, or there's a strong chance of one further year. Kind of difficult to tell. I think you said previously, Stuart, you know, there's just not enough time for a new government to make those big changes in the structure of the settlement. That 2-week window they're going to have between the election and the provisional. It's
I mean, it's, on the other hand, it's quite tempting to regard it as free money for a scheme that is perhaps discredited, or at least people have lost enthusiasm for it. But against that, again, the houses are built by that time, you know, so people are reasonably expecting to be given some reward for that. So I think it is on the cusp. I think I would, on balance, I would come down with a 1-year continuation.
Yeah, I think I'm going to update the model after we've got over this current period, probably next month, and just put that in as an option. The default setting being there is one more year, but you can switch it off if you want to look at the impact of it not being in there. For lots of councils with the minimum funding guarantee, the answer is 0. You know, it doesn't make any difference at all. But I know for Peter at Cornwall, that will be a real issue.
Yeah, £3 to £4 million possibly, Adrian. That
Yeah.
could be another years of funding.
Yeah. It's been NHB's been a good thing for you, hasn't it, Peter?
Yes, yeah, it has. Yeah.
Keep it going. Yeah. And then Martin, GLA, big elections coming up there. That could make a big difference. But normally, Martin, you get a bung outside the settlement. No one notices. So,
well, let's not go there because, I suppose it's slightly odd that you had a press release announcing all 100 million extra supposedly for districts, and the Mayor of London got more than all 160 districts combined, but I won't say any more than that. I'd probably get to the sack. But anyway, that's exactly what the rationale for that was. I sometimes find they love to hate us, but they love to give us money even more. But anyway, that's just the way of things. But we'll see what happens, because obviously we have got, a number of local elections, and obviously all the mayoral combined authorities have got elections on the 2nd of May, as well as the Mayor of London. So there'll be no doubt lots of interesting debates that come out of that around fiscal devolution and how they'll intend to fund their funding plans, etc. So that might help to drive some of the debate as well. Yeah,
and actually, the other thing we kind of forget sometimes is that horse trading within Whitehall about council tax increases, it's not just about local government, is it? It's also about how much that goes to fire, how much goes to police, and how that's split up. Fire's had kind of the rough end of it, really, and districts have a bit more for social care authorities, a bit more again for police.
I think that's the difficulty of sort of trying to make this work across various government departments, because the Home Office don't necessarily do things consistently around the fire service versus the police service. So, for example, the fire pensions grant was frozen this year and it's now been rolled in, whereas the police pensions grant went up about 120%. So there's no real consistency there now, except there will be some sort of disparity, but there doesn't seem to be a sort of a joined up approach, even, within some departments, the treatment of different services. So
that's a bit of doesn't help, does it? Doesn't help. Jeff raising that I forget what it's called now, the EPR, the packaging reforms might come in 25-26. God help us. I hope not. I know it's money, but I mean,
I don't believe that for a moment.
Yeah,
I actually introduced the first round of producer responsibility in the first packaging reforms, but I don't believe that the second round is going to happen in 25-26.
Yeah.
Stuart, I'm only saying that because correspondence came out this week saying that it was, but yes, that also happened in 23, 24, and 24, 25, now 25, 26. But I'm pretty sure if it ever comes in, it'll come hand in hand with responsibility around picking up food waste and the fact that there'll be shortfalls in that one as well.
Yes.
Yeah. But there was income attached to that.
Maybe right.
Yeah.
Oh,
there was income attached to it.
The EPR is a massive tax on providers that is expected to be given to local authorities with no financial responsibility. So it always looked too good to be true, Adrian.
Yeah. Bring it on. Maybe that's one way of getting more money into local government without,
I never understood why there was the notion of reducing the money to local government. If businesses are paying this additional tax, it's surely because they expect and the country expects extra recycling. So why would you net off money, which is paying for the baseline level of recycling? That wasn't the thinking for the first round.
Yeah.
Interestingly, just on a side note, when we introduced the landfill tax, there was a direct reduction in national insurance from the extra tax proceeds. So we were taxing an environmental bad and reducing the tax on a labour good. Though I guess the whole £100 or more is probably not devoted to that purpose now.
No, it's a good point, actually. And I wonder whether Labour might be kind of, assuming they are going to form the next government, that could be the kind of thing they're really interested in, shifting the burden around rather than increasing it too much. Yeah, could be. Could be. Yeah. Well, we're almost at 11:30. So thank you very much for your session today, Stuart, and your contributions after. It's been really interesting to get that kind of inside angle about what might happen and what the mechanics might be. Jeff, thank you for all your contributions over the months. Thank you. I'm sure we'll see you again. Not to go far. It's brilliant. Thank you very much. Cheers. Thank you all. The recording will be out fairly soon, but we'll see you soon. Thank you.